Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing Fields by the band Fields. Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog. So many fields to find, so many fields all around, and field is the name and the title. So many fields to find, what can we do with so many fields? I guess here's some of my favorite bits. Fields. If there's something that I've learned so far on the series, it's that 70s prog, and especially the early types of 70s albums and bands and artists from the early 70s in the prog scene, they're all some sort of this big tree with a lot of branches that go in many separate ways, but what it essentially means is that everyone is somehow connected to everyone, and well, this is one of the cases today. We are reviewing Fields, which is a pretty obscure band by its own, but you'll soon discover that they have a lot to do with mainstream prog in the early 70s. So who are Fields and what path of branches leads them back to the trunk of the mainstream prog? Well, the band Fields formed back in 1971 by the drummer Andrew McAuliffe, and he formed it alongside Alan Barry and Graham Field, which I never found any concrete information about it, but I do believe that the name of the band is named after him. Now right away you might have recognized at least one of these names, and that's Andrew McAuliffe. Now if you don't know who he is, he actually used to play as a part of King Crimson, and you can find him as the drummer on their third studio album of Blizzard, which I personally really like, and I love the drumming on there as well as many other things, so I'm really happy to know that he's also on here. Now in other news, Graham Field was actually the founding member of the progressive rock band Rare Bird, and he left it in order to join Fields. And Alan Barry actually played back in the mid-60s in a band called the Downlands, which contained both the Giles brothers, which you might know have gone on later to form King Crimson. Now in some sense, Fields was probably one of the earliest manifestations of a prog supergroup. Yes, these guys weren't just your average school friends which met up and wanted to create a band like Pink Floyd or Genesis. No, these guys were specifically chosen to put together into one place in order for them to create what is supposed to be really high standard and quality of progressive rock music. And well, in 1971, after prog got its kickstart, especially in the UK, and we started seeing some real all-time classics come out, Fields also went out with their debut album. And while this album did have some pretty good reception at the time, it didn't break anything too special, and it also seems to me right now that it kind of went in a different direction from the natural direction and progression of things that progressive rock was taking at the time. This album does hold true to the true spirit of progressive rock, with a lot of leading keyboards as well as very much being very experimentalist in its way, but the thing is, it seemed like there's a lot of old habits still living on in this album. A lot of old rock forms and tunes just find their way onto here, and it mostly seems to me like this album would have had a better classification if we just called it proto-prog. The songs on this album are unfortunately pretty much short all throughout, out. I think that the average song length on here is somewhere around like 3.5 minutes, which is not that special considering that also today you'd see that most songs range at this certain length. And well, I found it to be just a bit too redundant, seeing as stories start and end with each and every song. There's no seamless continuation to one another, they're just very much self-contained units. And honestly, I do believe that if Fields went in the direction of making one big epic or something like that, they would have gotten a lot more success in it. And honestly, while the quality of the music on here is pretty generally high, I do find that the band are somewhat afraid or somewhat weary to just take the leap of faith and try out what they really want to do. They're sticking to the past pretty much closely, and it just hinders them in not being able to progress alongside this thing that we call progressive rock. Now personally, where I sit with this album is pretty tricky, because I do find it to be pretty much forgettable in a way, but in another sense, I really like this album and what there is to be found on it. But I do believe that the only track on here which I really would come back to a lot of times right now has to be the opening track called A Friend of Mine. This one is a 10 out of 10 track. Really good, really promising for this album, but I kind of didn't have my hopes up because I knew that the rating for it was pretty much iffy when I saw it on the Prog archives. But still, this song is amazing. It does almost everything right in my opinion, and the little imperfections, well, they just make it more perfect. And this one seems to be inspired a lot by the general ELP sound, other than the fact that ELP kind of didn't really establish a sound back then, so technically one might say that ELP were inspired by Fields. Of course, that is just speculation, but this song is truly good, very well made, and I honestly think that everyone should go ahead and listen to it, even if you don't want to listen to the entire album itself. Now, when it comes to the rest of this album, while I wasn't blown away by it in any sense, I do find that it has some really good songs on it, and the songwriting as a whole, well made. The playing itself, very good, does play out like a supergroup in a way, just maybe not that realized quite yet. And honestly, the thing with me and this album is that I was listening to these songs and I was thinking to myself, you know what? They're not the best in the world, I know that objectively, but subjectively I just couldn't help not liking them. All of them were great and consistently great, and that's something that you cannot say about a lot of albums that I review on here. But the fact is, this album has some pretty straight great songs on it, and I had to give it that. And this band didn't plan on stopping, and in 1972 they recorded their second studio album. But the thing is, back at the time in the CBS record label, there were some management changes, and well, the new guys up there didn't really look fondly too much at Fields, and they decided that they didn't want to release their sophomore album. Thus, it remained shelved for another 43 years until it finally saw the day of light in 2015. And as it seems to me, this one, despite coming out so late in their discography, seems to hold pretty much the same esteem as the first one, which might mean that they have a pretty similar sound to them. But of course, I didn't listen to the second album, and I might do so, but maybe only next year. And the story of Fields pretty much ends over here when in 1972, due to the lack of support that they had from their record company, these guys just kind of disbanded and each member went their own way. So Fields had gone back to his original band of Rare Bird, while McAuliffe went ahead and formed Green Slade, which would actually grant him some pretty major success. And Barry himself would go back to his more rockier influences and form the UK band of King Harry, and thus all of these guys have come back to the branches of the Tree of Prog. But all in all, this album isn't really that of an inexpensible addition to the world of prog, especially from the early 70s, which has seen a lot of great albums. But for anyone out there who just feels like they've also seen a lot of the earlier stuff and you feel like there's not a lot more to discover nowadays, if you don't know this one, I would highly suggest you go ahead and check it out, because it's definitely a very interesting album and quite easy to digest as well. So I actually really like this cover art. Something about it just makes me feel like it's one of those very early Vertigo label covers. I don't know exactly why, but it just feels like it. And yes, something about the raw and very natural representation to be found on here, with the eagle basically capturing the rabbit or the hare or whatever that is just looks to me so interesting. The fact that it's romanticized by the way that it's drawn is all the more compelling, and definitely if I saw this album cover in the store, I would go ahead and check it out. So this album might not be the most proggiest entry on the series so far, but honestly it did not compromise on quality nor on my enjoyment of it, and thus it's gonna get a very respectable rating of 8 out of 10. But that's about it guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're gonna be listening to Is by Il Balletto di Bronzo. Yes, Italian. Prog. I of course want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Warner, Wrist of Kings, and Lindsay Haycox. You guys are just the best, and if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my about page. But that's about it guys, have a wonderful day and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye guys.